The first thing I noticed about him wasn't his smile, though God knows that would come to haunt me later. It was the way he carried the boxes, effortlessly, like they weighed nothing, his forearms flexing beneath sun-kissed skin as he navigated the narrow staircase of our summer rental. I stood in the doorway of what would be my room for the next 3 months, pretending to organize my already organized belongings while stealing glances at this stranger who would share my space, my kitchen, my quiet morning coffees. "You must be the other guy," he said, setting down a box marked kitchen stuff in blocky handwriting. When he straightened and looked at me directly for the first time, I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition I wasn't ready to name. "I'm Mason." "Alex," I managed, and his smile widened, genuine and unguarded in a way that made me forget momentarily how to breathe properly. "This is going to be fun," he said, and I nodded like I agreed, like I had any idea what I was agreeing to. The house was one of those beach rentals that looked charming in photos but revealed its quirks quickly. The bathroom door that stuck, the kitchen faucet that had to be turned just so, the way the sound carried between the thin walls. Mason seemed unbothered by these imperfections, approaching each discovery with an easy laugh that filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty. I'd taken the summer job at the Marine Research Station partly for the experience, partly for the decent pay, but mostly to escape the suffocating familiarity of my college town. What I hadn't anticipated was sharing 3 months with someone whose presence would make escape impossible, not from the house, but from myself. Mason worked construction, which explained the golden tan that seemed painted onto his skin, the easy strength in his movements. He'd graduated the year before with a degree in environmental science. He told me while we assembled the rickety table we'd found at a secondhand store, but wanted to save money before looking for real jobs. The way he said it, with air quotes and a self-deprecating grin, made it sound like an adventure rather than a delay. "What about you?" he asked, holding one end of the table steady while I fought with the screws. "Pre-med," I said, the word feeling heavy and predetermined in my mouth. "This is supposed to be good experience for my applications." He nodded, but something in his expression suggested he heard what I didn't say, that I wasn't entirely sure it was what I wanted, that sometimes I felt like I was following a script written by someone else. "Well," he said, "at least we'll both be exhausted at the end of the day. Makes for good roommates." If only it were that simple, I thought, but smiled and agreed. The first week passed in a careful dance of establishing routines. Mason left earlier than I did, his alarm going off at 5:30 with a cheerful beep that seemed obscene at such an hour. I'd lie in bed listening to him move through his morning ritual, the shower running, the coffee maker gurgling to life, his voice humming something wordless and off-key. By the time I emerged, he'd be gone, leaving only the lingering scent of his soap and a clean mug in the sink. My days at the research station were structured and predictable. Water samples, data entry, the occasional boat trip to collect specimens. It was good work, meaningful in a way that felt solid beneath my hands. But my mind had a tendency to wander, especially during the long afternoons when the lab grew quiet, and I found myself thinking about what Mason might be doing under the summer sun, whether his laugh carried across construction sites the way it filled our kitchen. Evenings were when the careful distance we maintained began to blur. He'd arrive home sun-drunk and tired, his t-shirt clinging to his chest with sweat, and I'd have to focus very deliberately on whatever I was reading, whatever I was cooking, anything but the way he moved through our shared space with unconscious grace. "Smells incredible," he'd say, appearing beside me at the stove with that easy smile, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "What are we having?" We. Such a small word to carry so much weight. Those first dinners were careful affairs. Polite conversation about our days, neutral topics that kept us safely on the surface. But gradually, as the days accumulated into a week and then two, the conversations began to deepen. He told me about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, about parents who loved him, but didn't quite understand his choice to delay graduate school. I found myself sharing stories I rarely told, about the pressure I felt to follow a predetermined path, about sometimes feeling like I was living someone else's life. "You know what I think?" he said one evening, leaning back in his chair with a beer balanced on his knee. We'd finished eating an hour ago, but neither of us had made a move to clear the table. "And what? I think you're scared of disappointing people, but maybe the person you should be most worried about disappointing is yourself." It was such a simple observation, delivered without judgment or pretension, but it hit me like a physical thing. I stared at him across the small table, at the way the setting sun coming through the window caught the gold in his hair, and felt something dangerous unfurling in my chest. Maybe, I said, because it was safer than yes or you're right, or how do you see me so clearly when I can barely see myself? He smiled then, soft and understanding, and I had to look away before I did something stupid like reach across the table to touch his hand. The nights were the hardest part. Our bedrooms shared a wall, thin enough that I could hear him moving around, the creak of his bed when he settled in for the night. Sometimes I'd lie awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering if he was asleep, wondering what he dreamed about. It felt like a violation of privacy, this accidental intimacy, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from listening. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I first ventured into the kitchen for water and found him already there, leaning against the counter in boxers and a faded t-shirt, scrolling through his phone with a glass of milk in his free hand. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, looking up with a smile that seemed to glow in the dim light from the street lamp outside. "Too hot," I lied, very aware of my own sleep-rumpled appearance, the way my voice sounded rough with sleepiness. "Yeah, the AC unit in my room sounds like it's dying," he said. "I keep thinking it's going to give up completely." I moved to the sink, acutely conscious of the space between us, the way the kitchen seemed smaller in the darkness. He didn't move as I filled my glass, close enough that I could see the flutter of his pulse at the base of his throat, close enough to smell the clean scent of his skin beneath the fading cologne. "Better?" he asked when I turned around, and it took me a moment to realize he was talking about the water. "Yeah," I said, though my mouth still felt dry. "Thanks." We stood there in the quiet, him leaning against one counter, me against the opposite, the small kitchen stretching between us like an ocean. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Normal, everyday sounds that felt amplified in the intimate darkness. "This is nice," he said softly. And I wasn't sure if he meant the coolness of the kitchen, the quiet of the house, or something else entirely. "Yeah," I agreed, because it was this stolen moment, this accidental intimacy. The way he looked in the dim light like something from a dream I might have had but never admitted to myself. We talked quietly about nothing important. The movie he'd watched before bed, the book I'd been trying to finish for weeks, plans for the weekend that felt both casual and significant. It was the kind of conversation that could have happened anywhere, anytime, but felt precious because of when and where. 2 a.m. in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and something indefinable that was just us. When we finally said goodnight, I lay in bed replaying every word, every gesture, the way he'd smiled when he wished me sweet dreams. It was dangerous territory, this careful cataloging of moments. But I couldn't seem to help myself. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened, cheerful and casual over breakfast, and I followed his lead gratefully. But something had shifted. A door opened just slightly, and I found myself hoping for more sleepless nights, more quiet conversations in the safety of darkness. It became a pattern, these late-night encounters that neither of us acknowledged in daylight. Sometimes I'd find him already in the kitchen when I ventured out for water or a snack. Sometimes he'd appear minutes after I'd settled against the counter, like he'd been waiting for some signal I didn't realize I was sending. We never planned these meetings, never mentioned them the next day, but they became the moments I looked forward to most. "You know what's weird?" he said one night, about 3 weeks into our cohabitation. We were in our usual positions, him by the stove, me by the sink, glasses of water sweating in our hands. "What?" "I've lived with roommates before, but it's never felt this." He paused, searching for the word, and I held my breath waiting for him to finish. "Comfortable, I guess. Usually there's all this negotiating, about space and boundaries and who does what. But this feels easy," I supplied, and he nodded, relief spreading across his features. "Yeah, easy." Easy was not the word I would have chosen. There was nothing easy about the way my pulse quickened when he smiled at me, nothing easy about pretending not to notice when he emerged from the bathroom with a towel slung around his hips, his hair dark with water. But I understood what he meant. The fundamental compatibility, the way our routines fit together without friction, the absence of the usual roommate tensions. "I'm glad," I said, and meant it, even though glad was too simple a word for the complex tangle of emotions he inspired. "Me too," he said, and there was something in his voice, a warmth that made me wonder if our careful friendship meant more to him than he let on. The thought was dangerous, a door I couldn't let myself open. But in the quiet darkness of the kitchen, with his eyes soft and unguarded, and it was hard to remember why I needed to keep it closed. As July melted into its final days, the careful boundaries we'd established began to blur in small but significant ways. It started with casual touches, his hand on my shoulder when he passed behind me in the kitchen, my fingers brushing his when he handed me something. Innocent contact that felt charged with possibility, moments that lasted half a second too long to be entirely casual. I told myself I was imagining it, reading too much into friendly gestures. But then I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decode, something soft and wondering that made my chest tight with hope I didn't dare name. The morning I walked into the living room to find him changing shirts was the moment I realized how far past casual friendship I'd already fallen. He was standing with his back to me, pulling a clean t-shirt over his head, the muscles of his shoulders shifting beneath sun-warmed skin. I should have announced myself. Should have looked away, should have done anything but stand there drinking in the sight of him. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but memorize the line of his spine, the way his hair stuck up in the back from the shirt. When he turned around, still adjusting the hem, he found me standing frozen in the doorway like a deer in headlights. Sorry, I said quickly, heat flooding my cheeks. I didn't realize I should have. It's fine, he said, but something flickered across his face, too quick for me to interpret. It's not like you haven't seen a guy in a t-shirt before. He was smiling, trying to make it casual, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on my face, searching for something. I wanted to say something clever, something that would dispel the tension crackling between us, but my brain had apparently short-circuited. Right, I managed. Of course. We looked at each other for a beat too long, the air thick with unspoken things, before I mumbled something about needing coffee and fled to the kitchen. I heard him laugh behind me, soft and maybe a little breathless, but I didn't trust myself to look back. That afternoon, I caught myself replaying the moment obsessively. The surprise in his eyes, the way he'd said my name like a question I couldn't answer. Had there been something there, some flicker of awareness? Or was I projecting my own feelings onto neutral interactions? I was still turning it over in my mind when he suggested we play cards on the balcony after dinner. It was something we'd done a few times before, using an old deck we'd found in one of the kitchen drawers. But tonight felt different somehow. The air was thick with late summer humidity, the kind of evening where everything moved slowly, where the light took its time fading. We sat across from each other at the small table he'd dragged from inside, our knees bumping occasionally in the cramped space. Each contact sent electricity up my spine, brief connections that felt significant in a way that made no logical sense. He didn't seem to notice, dealing cards with easy concentration, but I found myself hyper-aware of every point where our legs might brush. So, he said, arranging his hand with careful attention, tell me something I don't know about you. It was the kind of open-ended question that could go anywhere, but sitting there in the golden light with his knee pressed against mine, it felt loaded with possibility. Like what? I don't know. Something real. Something that matters. I studied his face, trying to gauge what he was asking for, how much honesty he actually wanted. The careful distance we'd maintained seemed fragile, suddenly, like something that could be broken with the wrong word, the wrong revelation. I used to want to be a writer, I said finally, the admission feeling strange in my mouth. I hadn't told anyone that in years, had barely admitted it to myself. His face lit up with interest. What kind of writing? Stories, I guess. Fiction. I used to write all the time in high school, but then college happened and pre-med seemed more practical, more acceptable. To who? The question was gentle but pointed, and I realized he was seeing right through to the heart of it, the way I'd shaped my choices around other people's expectations rather than my own desires. Everyone, I said with a laugh that didn't quite land. My parents, my advisors, myself, I guess. It seemed like such a long shot, like something people dream about but don't actually do. But you still want to do it. It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made my chest tight. Maybe, sometimes, when I let myself think about it. He nodded slowly, still looking at me with that intense focus that made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed. I think you should, he said simply. I think you should let yourself want things that matter to you, even if they're scary. There was something in the way he said it, some weight behind the words that suggested we weren't just talking about writing anymore. The air between us felt charged, full of things neither of us was quite brave enough to say directly. Your turn, I said. deflecting before I could do something foolish like ask what he meant, like push at the boundaries of our careful friendship. He considered for a moment, absently shuffling the cards in his hands. I'm terrified of being ordinary, he said finally, of living a life that doesn't mean anything, that doesn't leave any kind of mark. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if I'm wasting time, if I should be doing something bigger, something that matters more. Construction matters. I said, building things, creating spaces where people live their lives, that's important work. Maybe, he said, but I could see the doubt in his expression. But is it enough? Is it what I'm supposed to be doing with my life? The vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch his hand, to tell him that anyone who could see the world the way he did, who could make ordinary moments feel significant just by being present in them, could never be ordinary. But that felt like too much, like crossing a line I wasn't sure existed. I don't think anyone really knows what they're supposed to be doing, I said instead. I think we're all just trying to figure it out as we go. He smiled at that, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That's either very comforting or very terrifying. Both, probably. We played cards until it was too dark to see them clearly. Conversation flowing between the game and deeper territories, the kind of talk that felt like mapping previously unexplored country. By the time we finally went inside, something had shifted between us. Not broken open, but cracked slightly, letting in just enough light to suggest what might be waiting beneath the surface. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the way he'd looked at me when I talked about writing, the focus and encouragement in his expression. It had been a long time since anyone had listened to my dreams with that kind of attention, had suggested they were worth pursuing rather than something to grow out of. The memory of it made my chest warm and tight with something I was still afraid to name. In the morning, he left a note on the kitchen counter along with my coffee. Writers need good coffee. Don't let anyone tell you dreams aren't practical. M. I stared at the note for a long time, at his sprawling handwriting, at the casual kindness that felt like it meant everything. Then I folded it carefully and slipped it into my wallet, where I could carry it with me like a secret promise. The grocery store trip happened by accident. I'd been planning to go alone, as usual, but Mason appeared in the kitchen just as I was grabbing my keys, hair still damp from a shower, wearing a button-down shirt that made his eyes look impossibly blue. Mind if I tag along, he asked. I need to grab a few things. I should have said it was no problem, should have kept it casual and practical. Instead, I found myself nodding and trying not to think about how much the simple request pleased me. The drive to the store was filled with his playlist, a mix of indie folk and classic rock that felt like a soundtrack to a life I wanted to live. He sang along unselfconsciously, tapping rhythms against his thigh, and I had to focus very deliberately on the road to keep from staring. You have a good voice, I said when the song ended, and he laughed, ducking his head with something that might have been shyness. My mom always said I should have joined choir, but I was too self-conscious. You don't seem self-conscious about much. You'd be surprised, he said. And there was something in his tone that made me want to ask what he meant. What hidden uncertainties lived behind his easy confidence? The grocery store was crowded with the usual weekend rush, families with screaming children and college students stocking up on ramen and energy drinks. We grabbed a cart and started at the produce section, working through our respective lists with the kind of casual efficiencies that felt domestic in a way that made my heart race. What are these? He asked, holding up a package of something leafy and green. Chard, I said. It's good sautéed with garlic. Show me how to make it sometime? The question was casual, the kind of thing friends say to each other without thinking. But standing there in the fluorescent lighting with a head of lettuce in my hands, it felt significant, like a promise of future evenings together, of shared meals and conversations that stretched long past necessity. Sure, I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than it felt. We moved through the store with easy coordination, him grabbing items from high shelves I couldn't reach, me navigating the cart through crowded aisles. It was mundane, practical, the kind of task that should have been boring. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something we'd been doing for years. We make a good team, he said as we loaded bags into the car, and I had to turn away to hide the way his words made me smile. The drive home was quieter, the radio turned low, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I found myself stealing glances at his profile, at the way the afternoon light caught the stubble along his jaw. When we hit a red light, he turned and caught me looking, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, something unspoken passing between us. What? He asked softly, and I realized I should say something, should explain why I'd been staring. Nothing, I said instead. Just thinking. About what? About how this feels like a date, about how I wish it actually were one, about how I'm falling for you in ways that terrify me. About dinner, I said. We got a lot of good stuff. He smiled, but something flickered in his eyes, disappointment maybe, or recognition of the deflection. Yeah, he said as the light turned green. We did. That evening, we cooked together for the first time, moving around the small kitchen with surprising coordination. He chopped vegetables while I started the rice, both of us working in comfortable silence, broken by occasional questions about seasoning or timing. When he reached around me to grab something from the spice rack, his chest pressed briefly against my back, and I had to grip the counter to keep my hand steady. Sorry, he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. But he didn't move away immediately, and neither did I. We stood there for a heartbeat, maybe two, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, close enough to smell his shampoo and the fading scent of his cologne. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat, and we both pretended nothing had happened. Dinner was delicious, the kind of meal that tasted better for having been prepared together. We talked about work, about weekend plans, about everything except the moment in the kitchen that had left the air between us charged with possibility. This was fun, he said as we cleaned up, standing side by side at the sink, with me washing and him drying. The cooking? All of it. The shopping, the cooking, just doing normal stuff together. There was something wistful in his voice, something that made me wonder if he was feeling the same thing I was, this sense that what we were doing felt like more than friendship, like the beginning of something neither of us quite knew how to name. Yeah, I said, handing him the last plate like it was. Our fingers brushed as he took it from me, a contact that lasted half a second too long, and when I looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Alex, he said softly, and my name in his mouth sounded like a question, like the beginning of something important. But before he could finish whatever he'd been about to say, his phone buzzed with a text, breaking the spell. He glanced at it with a frown, then looked back at me apologetically. Rain check on that conversation? He said, and I nodded, though I wasn't sure what conversation he meant. What words had been hovering between us in that moment? Of course. He squeezed my shoulder as he passed, a brief touch that felt like a promise, and I spent the rest of the evening wondering what he'd been about to say, what door might have opened if we hadn't been interrupted. August arrived, with a heat wave that made the house feel like an oven despite the struggling air conditioning. We moved through our routines sluggishly, conserving energy for the essential tasks of work and sleep. The temperature seemed to compress everything, making the space between us feel smaller, more charged. I started taking cold showers twice a day and still felt perpetually overheated. Mason dealt with the heat by wearing as little as possible around the house, a strategy that was practical for him but torture for me. I'd gotten used to his casual approach to clothing, the way he'd wander around shirtless in the mornings or emerge from his room in just boxers and a t-shirt. But the heat wave seemed to have amplified everything, stripping away the last pretenses of modesty. I think I'm melting, he announced one evening, sprawling across the living room floor in nothing but shorts, a glass of ice water balanced on his chest. I tried very hard to focus on the book in my hands rather than the expanse of sun-warmed skin spread out in front of me, the way the condensation from his glass was creating rivulets across his ribs. The forecast says it should break by the weekend, I said, proud of how normal my voice sounded. Weekend's forever away, he groaned dramatically, and I made the mistake of looking at him directly. He was lying with his eyes closed, head tilted back, throat exposed in a way that made my mouth go dry for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. The setting sun coming through the window cast everything in gold, turning him into something that belonged in a painting, something too beautiful for ordinary afternoons. You're staring again, he said without opening his eyes, and my heart stopped. Again. Which meant he'd noticed before, had been aware of my wandering attention, my careful cataloging of his movements and expressions. Heat that had nothing to do with the weather flooded my face. It's okay, he said, opening his eyes and looking at me directly. I don't mind. The words hung between us, loaded with implications I didn't dare explore. Did he mean he didn't mind being looked at, or didn't mind me looking specifically? Was this friendly acceptance or something more? I should probably start dinner, I said, fleeing to the kitchen before I could do something stupid like ask him to clarify. But he followed me, padding barefoot across the linoleum, still carrying his glass of ice water like some kind of prop. Want help? He asked, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. We moved around the kitchen with our usual coordination, but everything felt different now, charged with the acknowledgement that I'd been watching him, that he'd been letting me. When he reached past me to grab something from the cabinet, I felt the brush of his arm against my shoulder like an electric shock. When I handed him the can opener, our fingers lingered together on the metal handle. It's too hot to cook anything complicated, he said, leaning against the counter, with that easy grace that seemed so natural to him. Sandwiches, I suggested, and he nodded, then surprised me by stepping closer. You've got something, he said, reaching up to brush at my hair. Dow dust, I think. His fingers combed through the strands near my temple with gentle precision, and I stood frozen, afraid that moving would break whatever spell was happening between us. He was close enough that I could see the flecks of green in his blue eyes, close enough to count his eyelashes if I'd been brave enough to look directly. There, he said softly, his hand still buried in my hair. We stayed like that for a heartbeat, maybe two, his fingers still tangled in my hair, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. The kitchen felt impossibly small, the air thick with more than just humidity. Then the spell broke. Or maybe we broke it, both of us stepping back simultaneously, the moment dissolving into awkward laughter and busy hands reaching for sandwich ingredients. But something had shifted, some boundary crossed or at least acknowledged. The careful distance we'd maintained was cracking, letting in possibilities that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. The power went out on a Tuesday night, August heat finally overwhelming the old electrical system. One moment we were in the living room, him reading on the couch while I worked on my laptop, and the next we were plunged into darkness, the sudden silence eerie after the constant hum of air conditioning and electronic devices. Well, Mason said into the darkness, and I could hear the smile in his voice. That's not ideal. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate his face, relaxed and amused despite our circumstances. I think I saw some candles in the kitchen, I said. I'll check the breaker box, he said, standing and moving carefully toward the hallway. But I'm guessing this is bigger than just us. He was right. Looking out the window, I could see that the whole street was dark, other houses just shadowy shapes against the night sky. The heat, which had been oppressive with the air conditioning running, quickly became unbearable without any air circulation. Mason returned with the verdict that it was definitely a widespread outage, and I'd found an impressive collection of emergency candles in various kitchen drawers. We set them up around the living room, creating pools of warm light that made everything feel intimate and removed from the ordinary world. It's actually kind of nice, he said, settling onto the floor with his back against the couch. When's the last time you sat somewhere with no screens, no background noise? I lowered myself to the floor across from him, close enough that our knees were nearly touching, close enough to see the way the candlelight played across his features. I honestly can't remember, I said, and realized it was true. The silence between us felt different without the usual electronic hum, more complete somehow. I could hear his breathing, the distant sound of traffic from the main road, the settling sounds of the old house around us. This reminds me of camping with my family when I was a kid, he said, leaning forward slightly so his elbows rested on his knees. My dad would always forget to bring enough batteries for the lantern, so we'd end up sitting around the fire telling stories. What kind of stories? Ghost stories, mostly. My sister loved getting scared. She'd make us tell them even though she'd have nightmares for weeks afterward. The fondness in his voice made me smile. Sounds like a good sister. The best, he said. She's getting married next month, actually. I'm supposed to give a speech at the reception. Are you nervous? Terrified, he admitted with a laugh. I love her more than anything, but talking about feelings in front of people, not exactly my strong suit. It was such an honest admission, this glimpse of vulnerability beneath his usual confident exterior. The candlelight made everything feel confessional, like secrets were easier to share in the flickering half-light. I think you're probably better at talking about feelings than you give yourself credit for, I said, thinking of all our late-night kitchen conversations, the way he'd encourage me to pursue writing, the gentle way he'd push me to examine my own motivations and desires. Maybe, he said. But he was looking at me with something that might have been gratitude. You bring out a different side of me, I think. The words hit me like a physical thing, warm and unsettling in my chest. I wanted to ask what he meant, what side of himself he thought I'd revealed, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid of hoping for too much. Can I tell you something? He said suddenly, his voice lower than before, more serious. My heart started beating faster, some instinct recognizing that we were approaching dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that couldn't be taken back once it began. Of course, I said, though my voice came out rougher than intended. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the candlelight, and I had the sense that he was gathering courage, preparing to cross some invisible line we'd been dancing around for weeks. But you have to promise not to make it weird, he said finally, leaning forward slightly so the space between us felt even smaller. The candles flickered between us, casting moving shadows across his features, and I realized we were balanced on the edge of something that would change everything, that would make going back to careful friendship impossible. I opened my mouth to promise, to give him whatever reassurance he needed to continue, but the words stuck in my throat. Because whatever he was about to tell me, whatever confession was waiting in the charged space between us, I knew it would shatter the careful walls I'd built around my feelings. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what we both needed. I promise, I whispered, though I wasn't sure it was true. Wasn't sure anything could stay the same after whatever came next. He smiled then, soft and nervous and beautiful in the candlelight, and leaned forward another inch, closing the distance between us to something that felt inevitable. The power stayed off, the candles burned lower, and in the humid darkness of our shared living room, with his knee finally deliberately pressing against mine, Mason opened his mouth to speak. And part two. I think about you, he said, the words barely above a whisper, like he was afraid speaking them too loudly might break whatever fragile spell held us in this moment. More than I should. More than friends are supposed to think about each other. The confession hung between us in the flickering candlelight, and I felt my breath catch somewhere in my throat. All the careful pretending, all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was imagining things, if the charged moments between us were real or just wishful thinking on my part. And here he was, making himself vulnerable in a way that felt like stepping off a cliff. Mason, I started, but he shook his head, leaning forward slightly, his eyes searching my face in the dim light. Let me finish, he said, and there was something desperate in his voice, like he needed to get the words out before he lost his courage. I know this complicates things. I know we have to live together for another month, and I know you might not, he paused, swallowing hard. I know you might not feel the same way. But lying there at night, listening to you move around in the next room, pretending this is just normal roommate stuff, I can't do it anymore. The air in the room felt impossibly thick, not just with humidity, but with the weight of his words, with the shift in everything I thought I understood about us. I stared at him across the small space between us, at the way the candlelight caught the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerable set of his mouth. You think I don't feel the same way? I asked, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. Something flickered across his face. Hope, maybe, or surprise. Do you? It was such a simple question, but it felt enormous, like the answer would reshape everything that came after. I thought about all the moments that had led us here, the late-night conversations, the way my heart raced when he smiled, the careful distance I'd maintained because I was so afraid of wanting something I couldn't have. Yes, I said simply, and watched relief flood his features. God, Mason, I've been going crazy trying not to feel the same way. He laughed then, soft and breathless, and the sound filled the space between us like music. Really? Really, I thought I was losing my mind, reading things into every conversation, every... I gestured helplessly at the small space between us, at the way we were sitting so close our knees touched. Every moment like this. You weren't imagining it, he said, and there was something wonderful in his voice, relief mixed with something that sounded like joy. I kept thinking maybe you were just being polite, just putting up with your weird roommate who couldn't keep appropriate boundaries. Appropriate boundaries, I repeated with a laugh. Is that what we've been trying to maintain? Trying being the operative phrase, he said. I've been failing spectacularly. We looked at each other in the candlelight, both of us smiling now, and I felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. The fear that had been living there for weeks, fear of rejection, of making things awkward, of ruining the best friendship I'd had in years, began to dissolve. So what now? I asked, because suddenly the summer felt full of possibilities I hadn't dared to consider. I don't know, he said honestly. I've never done this before. The wanting someone you have to live with, The not knowing if friendship is enough anymore. Me neither. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of confession settling between us. The candles had burned lower, wax pooling on the coffee table we'd moved them to, and outside the cicadas continued their endless summer song. Can I ask you something? He said eventually. Anything. When did you know that this was more than just roommate stuff? I thought about it, tracing back through the weeks we'd spent learning each other's rhythms, each other's stories. Maybe that first night in the kitchen, I said. When we talked until 2 a.m. about nothing important, there was something about the way you looked in the dark, the way it felt like we were the only two people awake in the world. He nodded slowly. For me, it was the grocery store. Which sounds ridiculous, but it doesn't sound ridiculous. You were reading labels on pasta sauce, completely focused, and I just thought, this is what I want. This ordinary moment, this person, this feeling like everything makes sense when we're together. The simple honesty of it made my chest tight. It did feel like a date, I admitted. Because it was a date, he said with a smile. At least it was for me. I just didn't have the courage to tell you. And now? Now I'm terrified and relieved and completely out of my depth, he said. But I'm tired of pretending this is casual friendship when it stopped being casual weeks ago. I wanted to reach for him then, to close the small distance between us and discover what it felt like to touch him with intention rather than accident. But something held me back. Not fear exactly, but the sense that we were in uncharted territory and needed to move carefully. What are you thinking? He asked, and I realized I'd been quiet too long, lost in the maze of my own thoughts. That I want to touch you, I said honestly, and I'm not sure how. His breath caught, visible in the candlelight, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than before. Like this? He shifted slightly, closing the gap between us so our knees pressed together more deliberately. And then, with careful slowness, he reached out and traced the back of my hand with his fingertips. It was such a simple touch, barely there, but it sent electricity racing up my arm. Yeah, I managed. Like that. We sat like that for a moment, his fingers drawing absent patterns across my skin, both of us watching the point of contact like it was something miraculous. And maybe it was. This first intentional touch, this acknowledgement that we were allowed to want each other, to act on the attraction that had been building between us. Your hands are shaking, he observed gently. So are yours. He laughed, the sound nervous but happy. I feel like I'm 16 again, trying to figure out how to hold someone's hand without making it weird. Is it weird? No, he said immediately, and it's perfect. Terrifying, but perfect. The candle nearest to us flickered and went out, leaving us in slightly dimmer light. Without thinking, I reached for the matches on the coffee table to relight it, and my fingers brushed against his as he reached for the same thing. We both froze, hands overlapping on the small box of matches, and looked at each other. Sorry, I said, starting to pull back. Don't, he said quickly, his fingers tightening over mine. Don't pull away. So I didn't. We sat there with our hands tangled together over a box of matches, both of us breathing a little too fast, both of us staring at the point where our skin touched. This is crazy, I said softly. Good crazy or bad crazy? The best kind of crazy. He smiled at that, and carefully, deliberately, he lifted our joined hands and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. It was chaste, barely there, but it felt significant in a way that made my heart race. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he said against my skin. Why didn't you? Because I was terrified you'd run screaming. And now? Now I'm terrified you'll run screaming, but I'm more terrified of not trying. I turned my hand in his, palm to palm, and felt his fingers interweave with mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like claiming something, like making a choice that would change everything. I'm not running, I said, and squeezed his hand to prove it. Good, he said, squeezing back. Because I don't think I could let you go now. We sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, both of us seeming to understand that this was enough for now, this acknowledgement, this first tentative step into whatever we were becoming. The power was still out, the candles were still burning low, and tomorrow we'd have to figure out what this meant for the rest of the summer, for our friendship, for all the practical complications of wanting someone you shared a living space with. But for now, in the intimate darkness with his thumb tracing circles across my palm, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just this. The warm press of his hand, the sound of his breathing, the knowledge that I wasn't alone in this feeling anymore. We should probably try to get some sleep, he said eventually, though he made no move to let go of my hand. Probably, I agreed, equally reluctant to break the spell. The bedroom's going to be like an oven without the AC. We could. I started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought, without suggesting more than I was ready for. Sleep in the living room? He suggested gently. It's cooler out here, and we've got the couch cushions we could put on the floor. I nodded, grateful that he'd found a way to extend this closeness without pushing boundaries either of us might not be ready to cross. We reluctantly released each other's hands and moved to arrange a makeshift bed on the hardwood floor, pulling cushions from the couch and finding extra pillows from our bedrooms. It was domestic in a way that felt both natural and charged with new meaning. Every brush of our arms as we arranged blankets, every shared smile in the candlelight, felt significant now that the pretense was gone. When we finally settled down, we were lying side by side on our backs, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, but not quite touching. The silence stretched between us, comfortable but electric. Alex? He said softly, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Yeah? Thank you for not making it weird. I turned my head to look at him, his profile soft in the dying candlelight. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for feeling the same way. Thank you for being worth feeling this way about. He laughed quietly, and I felt the sound in my chest like warmth spreading. We're going to be okay, aren't we? It was a bigger question than it seemed. About us, about the summer, about what happened when August ended, and we went back to our separate lives. But lying there in the dark with him, I found I wasn't worried about the future for once. Yeah, I said. We're going to be okay. The last candle burned out sometime after that, leaving us in complete darkness. I listened to his breathing gradually slow and deepen, felt the moment when he relaxed completely into sleep. But I stayed awake longer, replaying every word of our conversation, every touch, every look that had passed between us. When I finally started to drift off, I heard him shift beside me, his voice soft and drowsy in the darkness. Good night, Alex. Good night, I whispered back. There was a pause and don't pretend you didn't hear what I said earlier. Even in the dark, I could hear the smile in his voice, and I fell asleep with my own smile spreading across my face, knowing that everything had changed and that, for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid of what came next. To be continued.